It's time for us to start a Bible class. We're thankful for you being here. That was the second bell. I'm just going to stare at you until you sit down. Come on in and have a seat. As you're coming in, there are handouts on the back doors, or next to the back doors and upstairs as well. If you'd like to get a copy of the handout, we're going to be in John chapter 19 this morning, John 19. And as I said, there's handouts available on both sides if you'd like to grab one. But we're rapidly winding down on the book of John, but there is still the matter of the crucifixion that's coming, and then, of course, the resurrection. But we'll do a review briefly and then begin our Bible class. But thank you so much for being here this morning. Let's go ahead and bow together for a word of prayer, and we will jump into our Bible class. Let's pray. Our great God and Father in heaven, thank you so much for your great love towards us every morning. We're thankful, Father, so much that we can look out into the beauty of your creation on a wonderful day like this and see your glory reflected. And even on, Father, on the days where there's storms, and even on the days where there's wind and thunder and all those things, Father, it reminds us of your power and the fact, Father, that you are the God that sits above the circle of the earth, that you are the God that sits sovereign over this universe. And Father, no matter what befalls us in this life, we know, God, that you have eternity in your hands, and we know, Father, that we're in your hands. And we're so thankful, Father, for the sacrifice of Jesus, as we're reading about this morning, that even though he was without fault, Father, a sinful humanity condemned him to die, and we know, God, that there was no other way for that price to be paid, and we're so thankful for that he paid it. Bless us this morning as we study your word. Open our eyes and may behold wonderful things from your word. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. The book of John, we've identified a key verse, and we haven't done this in a couple of weeks just because we have moved primarily beyond where the word signs is used, except for the very end. And so if I were to ask you, what are the key verses, I guess, of the Gospel of John? What have we identified? What's going to help us to remember what this book is written for? All right, John 20, verses 30 and 31, and it says what? Give me a key word from John 20, 30, and 31, even if you can't quote it verbatim. All right, signs is one, okay? Many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciple. What's the purpose for the signs? All right, there's another key word, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing, what's another key word? You may have life in his name. As John writes his epistle, he focuses on the signs that Jesus did for the purpose that we, as the reader, even now 2,000 years later, can come to a understanding and a belief that Jesus is who he said he is, and he did what he said he did. And the purpose is that we can believe, but not just by believing, but that the belief can lead us to a trust in him, a faith that's going to lead us to eternal life. How many signs did John record for us? 7. Can you give me one? All right, water to wine, John 2. Give me another one. All right, raising Lazarus, the last one he did in John 11. What's another one? All right, the nobleman's son. All right, also John 2. What's another one? All right, the man beside the pool of Bethesda. All right, give me another one. Oh, the blind man, healing a blind man. Good. How many were we up to? Feeding of 5,000. I think there's one more. Walking on water. All right, what did you say? Was that it? Okay, good deal. Sorry, I'm hearing lots of mumbles this morning. I think it's me. It's not you. It's me. So, all right. And as Jesus then concludes his earthly ministry in John chapter 12, we get into his private ministry with his apostles, where he tells them some things about his departure, about how it's good for them as he leaves. And all the way through John 13 through 16, he's speaking directly to those apostles and giving them instructions for what's about to happen, but also the understanding that he's going to come out on the other side and he's going to bring them through on the other side. John 17 is a prayer to Jesus, a prayer to the Father, rather, by Jesus, what we call the high priestly prayer. And beginning in chapter 18 rather, we begin the Passion narrative, the atoning ministry of Jesus, beginning with his arrest, his trial before Annas, and then on into Pilate's hall, where we began talking about last week. Where we left off, again, this is just in the narrative beginning in John 18. Jesus has been arrested. He's been put on trial in Annas' house. He's been led from Caiaphas to the house of Pilate. John decides to overlook or not include in his gospel account the trial before Caiaphas. Instead, it's just that he goes there, and then immediately he's delivered over to Pilate. All the way through at the end of John 18, Pilate has questioned Jesus, and he has found no fault in him. And John 19, at least the first part, continues the efforts of Pilate to release Jesus. I asked you last week to note a couple of important words. I think they're on your handout still, that if you didn't write them down, they're there for you to mark if you'd like to. One of which is the title, Jesus, the King of the Jews. All right, it occurs about 8-9 times somewhere in this context at the end of chapter 18, going all the way through chapter 19. The truth. Jesus says, I have come, I've testified to the truth. Pilate's question that we explored last week, what is truth? But ultimately, Pilate's declaration that occurs all the way through this narrative of which we're drawing our points is that he has found no fault in him. That's worth underlining there in your Bible if you're not going to underline anything else. Pilate, in his examination from a court of law, Jesus has done nothing that's worthy of the capital crime, the capital sentence that the Jews are demanding of him. Why did the Jews deliver him to Pilate at all? Because they themselves couldn't put anybody to death. The Roman government allowed the Jews a certain amount of leniency to enforce their own religious laws. But if you were talking about a capital punishment, a death of some kind, you have to go for Roman authority and make sure that that person is convicted, that they are a convicted criminal, and then the governor or the judiciary is going to pronounce that because they're Romans. It's interesting that whenever you get over to Acts chapter 7, we read about what we call the first Christian martyr or the first witness who gives his life. Who is that? Stephen. Did it seem like that the Jews in their anger and their haste went to the governor and said, oh, by the way, we're about to stone this man to death? Their rabid hatred that began here with Jesus extended later on to to Jesus' followers. And as the Jews stoned Stephen to death, there's, of course, Paul that's breathing threats and murders against the church. And that continues on. Jesus said, if they're going to persecute me, what are they going to do to you? They're going to persecute you. 2 Timothy 3:12. Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. If there's no amount of resistance that you're facing for being a Christian, question we have to ask ourselves is, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Something to think about. As we get into John chapter 19, remember that Pilate has already examined Jesus. He's asked him some questions as we looked at the end of 18, and he has found him to be without fault. There's nothing this man has done that's worthy of death. At the end of 18, Pilate has a kind of goodwill tradition with the Jews. And Pilate, realizing here's Jesus who is innocent of everything that he's been examined of, and he even knows that the Jews have handed him over because of envy. Pilate's now looking at Jesus and thinking, how can I get this man released? Well, this goodwill offering between Pilate and the Jews says that during the feast, that is the feast of the Passover, the feast of unleavened bread that we're now observing, we have a tradition, Pilate says, that I'm going to release to you one political prisoner, one person that I'm holding that you guys want released. And here's the choice. You have Jesus, again, examined and shown to be without fault, or Barabbas. What was Barabbas' crimes? What was he done? All right, John describes him as a robber. What do the other gospel writers describe him as? A murderer and an insurrectionist. He's the dude going around stirring the pot. He is the one that's saying, let's go get those Romans. Let's cast them off. And that's his MO. That's why he's there in prison. And as Pilate goes through the annals of the most wanted there in Jerusalem and finds this man, don't you know he's got to think, this is the worst of the worst. Surely these people don't want this man released. So I'm going to make you an offer. Do you want Jesus, sinless, perfect, the one who's gone about doing good, or do you want this man Barabbas to be walking your streets where your children play, where your family does business? Who do you want? What do you think he thought whenever they immediately said, give us Barabbas? Give us Barabbas. There's got to be some kind of shock and awe. I imagine him standing there with his mouth open going, did I step in the twilight zone? What in the world is going on? What in the world's going on? All right. Sorry, I wasn't sure if somebody said something. So here's what Pilate does in continuing this narrative beginning of chapter 19. He scourges him, but he finds no fault. Once again, keep in mind the no faults all the way through this narrative. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. The soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put him on a purple robe. Then they said to him, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said, Behold, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that, here's our phrase, I find no fault in him. Pilate realizes that here's this man that they are intent on crucifying, intent on getting the capital punishment from. But you, if you're Pilate, you probably still got a modicum of justice being done. So now that they've cried out and said, we want Barabbas, crucify this man, what's your goal as Pilate? You still want justice to be done. You don't want to convict an innocent man. What are you going to do? All right, pass the buck. That may be part of it. Okay, you remember that he washed his hands in front of the Jews and said, I find, you take him, what did he say? He said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And the Jews said, his blood be on us and on our children. Okay, what does he do before he passes the buck? What do you want Jesus to appear as? I'm sorry? He scourged him. Why did he do that? To what? To try to appease the Jews. If I'm Pilate, because they're crying out for this innocent man, I now want this man to appear as humiliated and as wretched as possible. If you're appealing to somebody's compassion and you bring out a man who has got a purple robe on a back that has been torn open with the scourging, and he's got a crown of thorns pushed into his head as a mockery, don't you know if those Jews had had an ounce of compassion, they would have said, we're going home. Let him go. He is just as wretched and he's miserable. How do I release an innocent man while the Jews are crying for his blood? Out beside, at the end of verse 20 or 18 and before chapter 19, you might write the cross-reference Matthew 27:24. That Pilate saw on that occasion that there was a tumult or a riot that was forming. So Pilate's conundrum is, how do I release this innocent man? While the Jews are crying for his blood? His solution is scourging. I think Wayne brought up in his class several weeks ago that it's almost as a passing reference for something that's so monumentally painful and horrible to endure. There's some things that I can just hear, you talk about somebody that gets in an accident or talks about somebody that's, slicing through the tomatoes and, oh no, I just sliced my hand open, where you just, right? You automatically you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach. We read the word scourging and we don't think anything of it, really, because it's a practice that I don't know of many places where this is still practiced. And yet at the same time, when you know the horror of what's involved, don't you know that the early Christians and the readers that would have read this initially thought, because you're talking about beating a man and ripping the flesh off of his back, to where in a lot of cases, people didn't survive the scourging to go to the crucifixion. But they have ripped open his back. They have now mocked him. They twisted a crown of thorns. They put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. You ever had a wound that was open and you put on clothes over that wound? And then later on, after you've worn those clothes for a little while, you pull off the clothes. I'm thinking about just a hand injury or something like that. What happens? You pull the skin with it. You pull the wound open again. I've got to imagine that as Jesus wore that purple robe and before they crucified him, they stripped him of it and opened up all those wounds all over again. It's horrible, but again, these are just the first two verses. As they're doing this, they're also beating him. They're beating him. saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck him with their hands. Pilate's declaration as he brings this man who has been mocked, who's been beaten, who's now been also, of course, spit on, and who has been absolutely scourged. Pilate's motive here, please don't miss it, is to make Jesus to look as pathetic and miserable and humiliated and harmless as possible so that he can go his way. But we can't underestimate the power of hatred. Pilate says, "Behold, behold, look at this. Look at him. Observe him closely. I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him." The word in Greek, there's a couple of words for know. The word is gnosko, that you may know with certainty, that you may perceive that the jury is in, and he has a verdict firmly of not guilty. I've already examined him, that you can know that I find him not guilty. I'm bringing him out to you. Take a look at him. This is what your hatred has done to him. He's black and blue. He's got this crown of thorns on his head with the blood, I'm sure, running down into his eyes. He's got this purple robe that's now being soaked through with his blood based upon the scourging. Here he is. Look at him. Yes, sir.
I was curious if there was, going back to Pilate's like equivocation or dilemma, and then his pressure at home, right? His wife is on him about this. She knows what's happening. And it's kind of built into that the scourging may have been torturous to a point, like they were also interrogating him, or asking him things repeatedly. He reaffirmed that this was a fault-finding effort on his part as well. So he is interesting to study and think about as he was facing. His name will be remembered forever for assigning this
Right.
the way he did, but it's clear that he was in a personal dilemma as well. I'm wondering if that was also going on, that he kept reaffirming that he's not guilty of anything. I don't have any reason to do this. This is on you.
Right. Right. That's a good point to make. I mean, Pilate is in every instance of the situation between a rock and a hard place. Again, morally, he's got his wife at home going, have nothing to do with that righteous man. He's got the law that he knows he's supposed to be upholding, that Romans have put him in power for. He doesn't want to be guilty of skewing justice, and yet at the same time, here's the Jews that are crying out for his blood, and he realizes he's going to have a serious problem on his hands. You remember Acts chapter 19, that the city governor, the city ruler there in Ephesus, called all those people that were there ready to riot because Paul was, because Demetrius the silversmith had stirred him up. And the city ruler came in and said, "Listen, we're in danger of being called into question by Rome for the riot, for this day's activities. We better disperse. You don't want the Roman army coming after you for perceived insurrection or for perceived a riot out of control, because they're not going to be merciful to anybody." And that's a good point to make. So Pilate, again, in this effort, is trying to figure out, am I missing something? But he's also trying to take an innocent man that he knows is an innocent man, for when he says, "I found no guilt," and how can I release him? Yes, Richard.
I was going to tag on the end of what Todd was talking about. He was still in the process of interrogating him. And, I couldn't find any fault, but I think that's one of the things why he was scourged.
Yeah.
But then when you get down a little further, and maybe I'm stealing thunder here, I don't know. But
Please, steal it. Yeah.
back in to question him again, and he says, they said, he's not their God, but the Jews said, he made himself to be the Son of God. And Pilate's asking him, says, "Are you not stealing me? Do you not know I got the power to crucify you or to release you?"
Right.
And Jesus said, "You couldn't have any power against me unless it had been given to you from above. And the one who delivered me has the greater sin." And then in verse 12, we find out, John tells us, he says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him.
Right.
At that point, he knew, I don't want anything to do with this guy.
Right. Yeah, and that's a point that we'll make, absolutely. But yes, all the way through this, Pilate is still trying to discern and get to the bottom of what's going on here. But it's not till just a little bit later in our context that Pilate comes to that and says, this is it, I'm going to release to him. He is humiliated, but there's no fault. Continue to look, verse 5. Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to him, behold, take a good hard look at. Consider what you've done. Consider the man. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to him, you take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered and said, we have a law, and according to our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Pilate brings this man out and he says, behold him. This pathetic, miserable, bleeding mass before you. He's been humiliated, he's been mocked, he's been beaten with an inch of his life. He's standing there bleeding before you, black and blue, red with blood. Here's the innocence of this man, and here's a punishment. Here is what you wanted. With the Jews seeing Jesus, there was no pity, there was no self-examination, there was no remorse. They said, crucify him. People are bent on doing evil. There's no appeal to justice that matters to them. And when they saw the humiliated state of Jesus, it just spurred them on to say, we want the maximum penalty. This is not enough. It occurs to me that sin is not going to lead you to a world that you want to live in. Sin is never going to lead you to a world that you want to live in. A lot of people think that it will. Selfish people don't care about justice or unless it benefits and protects them. If you don't have a society that cares about justice, it isn't going to last very long. And while it does, it's going to be a miserable place to live. I think that's why sin becomes prevalent and begins to permeate a culture. It begins to fall apart as a culture. When foundational virtues like what we're observing here, like justice, get tossed out the window, it's really only a matter of time before that society collapses. The Jews wanted Jesus crucified, but they needed Pilate's consent to do it. Pilate's words, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. What's he saying to them? You ever get so frustrated with somebody? You're trying to help them. Fine, do it yourselves. I think that's where Pilate, you take him. I find no fault in him. Do it yourselves. A bit of sarcasm if he's mocking them. He says, I'm not going to give you Rome's approval. Knowing full well, again, that they're prohibited from doing that implies that threat. He's going to bring the authority of Roman government down on them if they attempt it. He might have said that also in an aggravated way, like we just mentioned. It's an expression of his frustration, his aggravation. But as Richard mentioned just a moment ago, we have a law. We have a law, and we have a law that, according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Because he made himself a Son of God. Has Jesus claimed to be the Son of God up until now? Has he? Okay, not in public, but to the disciples. Has John declared him to be the Son of God? Yes. Yeah, that was the passage I was thinking of, Phil. Flip back to John chapter 5. John chapter 5, this might be a good cross-reference to right beside this verse here. Jesus, in talking specifically to the Jews, this wasn't just his apostles. Verse 16, for this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus, sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Jesus answered and said, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working till now. And again, we'll just take a look at it and say, okay, he's working like his Father is. The Jews understood the implication of that in verse 18. They sought all the more to kill him because not only did he break the Sabbath, but he also said God was his Father, making himself equal with God. The Jews are now looking at this and saying, here's a man who claims to be equal with God. By the way, in this day and age that we're looking at, back in the first century in Rome, who also made themselves to be equal with God? There are a lot of the emperors that you're going to read about that claim to be the Son of God or to be God incarnate, right? There's a lot of people because Son of God is a title that's claimed by emperors. Pilate heard this and he became even more afraid because Augustus at this time claimed to be the Son of God. But the accusations of sedition had been put to rest at this point. But I think Pilate has been really is afraid because he begins to suspect that Jesus is more than a humble son of a carpenter from a poor fishing town in the backwoods of Galilee. I can't imagine that you'd talk to Jesus and realize and not realize that you were dealing with somebody special. And again, Pilate is not, as we mentioned, without a sense of right and wrong in this matter. He has struggled in determining what to do with Jesus. He's being manipulated by a mob into doing something he knew he shouldn't do. And the idea that Jesus was some way affiliated with God or the gods, as the Romans would have considered, was distressing to him. Mark, yes, sir.
Several times Jesus tells his disciples that he and the Father are one.
I and the Father are one. That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely.
And all his I am statements too, or the Jews know who he's claiming to be.
Right.
John reports a lot of them, and it's blasphemous for them to hear that, because he said that in the name of God, so they clearly, we see they understood his implication, they tried to grab him, wants to stone him for that.
Yeah.
So they understand that, and he's clearly made that at least known to them, that is who he is.
In the discussion of Father Abraham, we're Abraham's children. We've never been in bondage to anybody. And Jesus says, well, if you were Abraham's children, you'd do the things that Abraham did because Abraham believed God. And then they said, Jesus would go on in that discussion, John 8, to say, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. Oh, come on, you're not even 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? That great statement that Jesus made before Abraham was, I am, I exist. You know, I mean, I don't know how many more clear you can get, but the Jews, as you mentioned, Todd absolutely understood the implication of that because they picked up stones to throw at him because of that. And now here it is, they're delivered him over and saying this man made himself to be the Son of God. Somebody else? Good. Suffering servant. Oh, sorry. Ben, yes, sir.
Well, I was going to say, how many times did somebody first meet Jesus and knew something was different? So I'm sure Pilate felt that same way when he talked to the adulterous woman. You know, he was not only a man.
Yeah.
They knew there was something about him.
That's a great point to make. I mean, how long did Nathanael have to visit with Jesus before he knew there was something special about him just from the downbeat of John? You know, truly, Rabbi, you are the King of Israel. And Jesus said, are you saying this just because I told you I saw you under a tree? You know, he said, from now on, you're going to see greater things than these. You're going to see heaven open. You're going to see the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus being the ladder from heaven to earth, right there from the downbeat. But yeah, absolutely, that's true. You know, I mean, you can't visit with Jesus for very long and not know that you're dealing with somebody special, like John 4, the woman at the well. I mean, sitting there and going, I know the Messiah is coming. Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. And all the way through that context, I mean, she comes to an understanding that here's a man who's told me everything I've ever done. Could this not be the Messiah, or could this be the Messiah?
You brought up something I would, you know, I knew there was a Messiah, was prophecy. They weren't going to accept anyone as a Messiah, and they still haven't to this day.
All right. So what Debbie brings up is they knew there was a Messiah coming, but they weren't going to accept the one that came. They weren't going to accept anybody. I would amend that just a little bit to say they weren't going to accept anybody that didn't fit in their mind what the Messiah was supposed to do and what he was supposed to be. Sometimes we get upset because expectations don't match the reality. You know, I mentioned holiday feasts sometimes, you know, and we think, okay, we're going to have a grand occasion where we all sit around the table and it's just going to be just great. And, you know, before too long you have grandma throwing mashed potatoes at grandpa, you know, I don't know. Again, there's disappointment that comes because of that. But part of what the Jews had here on this occasion is the disappointment that had been matched with a anger towards Jesus that had now led to murder in their hearts, that we're not going to accept anything other than this man. Doesn't matter who he is, but we are so mad at him that we are going to get him nailed to the cross by any means necessary. Yeah, that's a great point to make. Yeah.
So, like, everything that's happening with Christ at this point, sometimes that we kind of specify all the Jews. A good portion of the Jews were not there whenever they got Christ before Pilate.
Sure.
Planned out overnight. Early morning. This is the Jewish leaders with their rabble.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't the rest of the Jews that are in Jerusalem at this time. Most of those guys it's a holy convocation. There's no work to be done on that day. So the nature of what's going on here, everybody's trying, Pilate washes his hands, Herod, find no fault in him.
Yeah. We don't have like 1.5 million people, that are standing around Pilate's hall, crying out for Jesus' blood. That's a great point to be made. And also the realization that, again, even though this may be happening with just a very small segment of the Jewish population, again, the reality is that the Jews rejected their Messiah overall, because it was the chief priest and that had given an order. And anybody knows where Jesus is, be sure and let us know. I mean, I think about the disciples on the road to Emmaus. As Jesus walks with them and they're talking, he says, "What are you talking about?" They said, "Well, are you a stranger to Jerusalem? Have you not been around? Have you not heard the news around the campfire about Jesus and everything? We thought this man was going to redeem Israel. We thought he was going to be Messiah." And Jesus then opens their minds and begins to explain to them all those things. But yes, it is the leadership of the Jews that are asking for this, because this is a determination that they made. That's a great point. Look at verses 8 through 12. He's continuing the interrogation. "Therefore, when Pilate heard the saying, he was even more afraid. And he went again into the praetorium," the governmental building here, "and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. And Pilate said, 'Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?' And Jesus said, 'You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who's delivered me to you has the greater sin.' From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.'" You can't help but hear the tumult of this scene. That as Pilate hears, "Crucify, crucify, crucify," he's going back in the building, and you can still hear that echoed on the outside. And Pilate's situation is now even more desperate, because as they're crying, "Crucify, crucify, crucify," where are you from? Where are you from? You're not answering me? Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you? I have the power to release you? And it's calm and it's collected, as when he stood up in that boat and said 2 words in Greek, "Peace, be still." You would have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who's delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Jesus is silent on his questioning, but the specific question of authority and power by Pilate, Jesus directs his mind heavenward. Heavenward. What is he talking about? What's he talking about? Daniel 4:17, the scripture. God rules, or the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. Has that ever been changed? Has there ever been a time that God hasn't been in charge? That God hasn't been sovereign over all the kingdoms of the earth? And that's a message specifically for Daniel whenever the people are in captivity and thinking, what in the world's happened to our nation? We thought we were God's chosen people, and now we're under the rule of the cruelty of Babylon. And Daniel's written primarily to help those Jews realize God's still on his throne. God's still in charge. God's still in charge. And Jesus says, "One who lived and delivered me over to you has the greater sin." What does that mean? Who has the greater sin in this, if we're answering this question? It's the Jews. Why? Because they had the knowledge. They had the knowledge. As Jesus answers Pilate and talks to him about his frustration, you read other parts of the Bible, again, it's pretty common for God to have to remind political leaders of their power that only belongs to them by permission. But when Jesus says, in light of the fact that you're in the position, God has put you in this position, the Jews were the ones that had the knowledge of what God's Messiah was supposed to be. They're the ones with the greater degree of sin. Are there greater sins and lesser sins? Let me rephrase. Are there greater punishments and lesser punishments?
I think Pilate was really, maybe this had to be something Jesus had to do to proceed forward. Because he was trying his best to get free and get it out, get away from all this.
Yeah.
And it's still sinful what he's doing, but he put it in a perspective
Pilate didn't ask to be in the situation, and that's exactly what Todd is saying. He was being asked to make a decision he didn't want to make. He hadn't been the one who woke up first thing in the morning to a situation where he said, you know what, I'm going to put this man who's innocent and to death today. He hadn't dragged Jesus into his courtroom with malicious intent. He woke up today with Jews screaming outside wanting the death penalty. But because it was his job, he had to pass judgment. His guilt in this situation was not the same as the guilt of the Jews who were accusing Jesus. For years, again, they had harbored this hatred of Jesus, and they were now lying about him. They were intent on destroying him at any cost. And as they were intentionally abusing a political system, a system of all people, that God's people, as Sarah mentioned, should have known that God governed, they're now using that same system to kill God in the flesh. They're now using the same system to kill the one who had told them, and authoritatively, and had demonstrated by the signs he did, we're back to the Gospel of John, that he is God's Son. The Jews were pressuring Pilate to make the wrong decision. And there's a difference between being thrown into a corrupt situation and making the corrupt situation and the fuel behind that corrupt situation. And that's why, again, as Richard mentioned a while ago, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. And the Jews said, you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. I think I said Augustus a little while ago. It's Tiberius Caesar that's reigning here during this time. What are they accusing Pilate of? Seditious. Yeah, there's disloyalty to Rome that you're demonstrating because you're no friend to Caesar. This man made himself to be a king, and if you let this man go, you're going to be in big trouble. Pilate gives and grants the death sentence in verses 13 to 16, but still Jesus has no fault. Chapter 19, verse 13. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out, sat down in the judgment seat in the place that's called the pavement, in Hebrew Gabbatha. Now after it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. But they cried out with him and said, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to him, shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they led Jesus away. Pilate went out to a place called Gabbatha. It's a pavement, it's the tribunal, it's the official pronouncement of a sentence. And he went out at the 6th hour. The 6th hour. Roman time, it's 6 a.m. 6 a.m. Most all of this has been done in the evening, the early morning. There's a lot of ways that I hate to be woken up before my alarm goes off, but having an angry mob of Jews demanding that here's a man who's guilty when I've examined him and there's nothing guilty that he's done. 6th hour, Roman time, 6 a.m. Pilate brought him out to the Jews, presented him as their king. The Jews responded by proclaiming their sole allegiance to Caesar. What did the Jews think about Caesar? They absolutely hated the rules of the Romans. They hated the rule of the Romans. And don't you know that Pilate knew that that was a complete lie? They didn't care what they said, just as long as it was going to get rid of Jesus. But they are blaspheming. Okay, in what respect? Right. Blaspheming God's name, saying they have no allegiance but to Caesar. One of the things when the Israelite king was established, God told them and responded about all the ways that the kingship that they wanted was going to require them, or going to cost them. But God's purpose was that they were still supposed to be allegiant to him first and foremost. That's the point. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
This was the day of preparation for the Passover.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Jews were killing the lambs for the Passover. Jesus is our final Passover lamb.
Jesus' death wasn't left up to chance. It wasn't left up to chance. The timing of this, as Richard's mentioning, was not a convenient accident, but is proof of the Bible's inspiration and God's sovereignty. In the orchestration of Jesus to fulfill shadows and pictures that he gave in the Old Testament, you can draw a line all the way back to Exodus chapter 12 and talk about Jesus being the perfect Passover lamb. I'm going to give these to you relatively quickly to understand something about that Passover, because again, this is not a coincidence that he's crucified during this time. The original Passover feast was created to give the Jews a picture of a greater freedom that was coming in the future. And God organized these details and over the period of hundreds of years, and now we have the privilege to look back in wonder. Jesus was called the perfect Lamb of God, the one who takes away the sins of the world, as John described him in John 1, verse 29. Jesus was, according to the law of the Passover, taken from among them. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 3, there was to select a lamb from among them. He was a mature lamb, a lamb of the first year, Exodus 3 through 5, or 12, 3 through 5. Jesus, being about 30 years old when he began his ministry, he was a mature Jewish male. He was examined, as we mentioned, again and again and again, and there was no fault in him. I think that's what John is talking about, specifically whenever Pilate says, I've taken him, I've looked at him, I've examined him, I find no fault in him. Are you sure, Pilate? Yes, I find no fault in him. Are you sure, Pilate? I have no fault in him. He is showing Jesus' qualification for being a sinless, a pure, unblemished Passover lamb. He was killed by the whole assembly. Exodus 12, verse 6, Richard mentioned this is day of preparation when the Passover lamb is supposed to be killed. And noticing that none of his bones were broken. That was part of the requirements given in Exodus chapter 12. You take the lamb, you take its blood, you put it on the doorpost, on the lintels of your house, so that when death comes, this is the 10th plague, when God pronounces the death of the firstborn, as we sing and kids sing, that God would pass by, that they would be protected by the blood of that lamb being there on their doorpost. But God said, you don't break any of its bones. Well, John would mention that there was not a bone of his that was broken. That's exactly right. You consider all that he went through and the efficiency, the cold efficiency of the Romans to be able to make somebody suffer as much as possible without even breaking their bones. It's just amazing to me. To drive the nails into the feet and into the hands without, with missing all the major arteries and veins and things like that, but also not being able to, or not breaking the bones. His sacrifice was accepted by God. His sacrifice was accepted. It shall be accepted. As death passes by, they'll know that they're safe. 1 Peter 1 talks about the fact that we know that we were not redeemed with silver and gold, that were corruptible things, but we were redeemed with the precious blood of a lamb, and that without spot. He was accepted by God. But the purpose for the Passover, all the way back from Exodus chapter 12, the very first Passover they ever observed, was God said, when you eat it with your clothes on, you eat it with the staff in your hand, you eat it all packed up, ready to go, because this night, when Pharaoh realizes, he's going to say, not just, okay, that's fine, you can go. Pharaoh's going to say, get out. I don't want you here anymore. You get out of this land. And God says, Israelites, you be ready to go in that time. Israel is a picture, a shadow of the reality that Jesus' blood as our perfect Passover is what sets us free, so that we are no more slaves to sin, but instead we come out and we're free. Yes, Pam?
This is how it's supposed to go. So if Pilate did find, well, obviously he didn't find guilty, but if they listened to Pilate and they didn't crucify him, then how would God die? Or how would Jesus die for all of us?
Yep.
How would that actually then play out?
You're going to hurt your head thinking like that, but yes. Sure. And the reality is God's purpose is going to be accomplished. God knew exactly how all of this would play out, and he let it play out. That song we sang this morning for Lord's Supper, the 10,000 Angels, love that song for a number of reasons. And the way Thomas led it, nothing wrong with that, but what's amazing to me is that they want you to sing, "He could have called 10,000 angels," after every single stanza. It's almost like that at any given point in the process, from the time that he was arrested, he could have called 10,000 angels. From the time that he was beaten, he could have called 10,000 angels. From the time that he was sped on and mocked and led through the streets, he could have called 10,000 angels. All the time that they nailed him to the cross and while his mom stood by, he could have called 10,000 angels. But the conclusion is, but he died alone for you and for me. The beauty of our Passover lamb.